Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. When the Separatist droid army was revealed on the world of Geonosis by Obi-Wan Kenobi, the news shocked the Galactic Republic. Sure, the Separatist crisis had been going on for 2 years already, starting in 24 BBY with Count Dooku giving the Raxus address. During that speech, he would criticize the Republic for being bloated and corrupt, and more importantly, showing favoritism towards the core worlds and neglecting the Outer Rim territories. The speech would also announce the establishment of the Confederacy of Independent Systems. Despite the rising popularity of Dooku and his message, secession was still seen as a political issue and not a military one.
He is a political idealist, not a murderer.
And the Galactic Republic was already home to many different trade blocs and political factions. The CIS was definitely the most popular during this period and presented a real problem as hundreds of systems began to leave the Republic. But many political leaders within the Republic Senate understood the political grievances these Outer Rim territories had. I'd go as far to say that some were even sympathetic and understanding about why they would choose to leave. The application process for joining the Republic had grown increasingly convoluted, and sometimes it took member states centuries, if not a millennia, to actually join. And even then, there was usually never direct representation for Outer Rim planets. They would usually be, grouped in together with an entire sector with which they might not have any cultural or historical ties with. This wasn't just because of bureaucracy. The core world favoritism that Dooku spoke of was real. The core regions didn't want to see their own power in the Senate get diluted by the addition of new worlds. They also didn't want to see their tax revenue being diverted to the development of infrastructure in the Outer Rim. Especially after the Nile Marauders resisted the High Republic-era expansionary efforts into the Outer Rim. Core World member states believed that the Outer Rim was just full of savages who culturally were unable to assimilate to Republic values, and therefore any money spent on these worlds was seen as a waste because of perceived corruption and chaos. And so while these Outer Rim territories leaving and banding together to create their own confederacy was worrying for more pro-Republic and hawkish factions in the Republic, most member worlds didn't care or were kind of neutral on this matter. But the emergence of the Separatist droid army was not only a provocation by the Separatists, but also an escalation that changed how people viewed the Separatist crisis. The change in the political climate would lead to Chancellor Palpatine getting another term in office for stability reasons, and he would also be given emergency powers that allowed him to create the Grand Army of the Republic out of the clone army that just conveniently appeared. Palpatine used the shock and fear created by the appearance of the droid army to get quite a lot of concessions, similar to a bandit holding a blaster to a merchant's head. There was very little the Republic wasn't willing to do to secure the core from an invasion. But little did they know, the greatest threat to the Republic wasn't the Separatist droid army. That could be contained, and the Republic was still many times the size of the Confederacy. As long as they survived the initial onslaught, in the long run, Republic wealth and production capability would outpace the Separatists. The biggest threat that the Republic had was the secession of more worlds and a snowballing effect that would take resources from the Republic and give it directly to the Confederacy. It's ironically the same strategy that the Alliance to Restore the Republic would adopt against the Empire in the future as well. While the secessionist movement, anti-Republic and anti-Jedi sentiment were rampant in the Outer Rim, the closer you got to the core, the more it dissipated. Even worlds in the Mid-Rim territories which bordered the Outer Rim were still staunchly loyal to the Republic, or so Coruscant thought. Relatively early on in the war, many planets in the Inner Rim and out that were loyal to the Republic began to defect as well, and this was because of one key weakness the Republic had. Coruscant was the heart of the galactic economy, and the various hyperspace lanes that connected all of the systems together were the veins through which trade, the blood that fueled the entire galaxy, flowed. It was this complicated galactic supply chain that allowed the Galactic Republic to expand way beyond its original territory. And more importantly, onto planets that without the import of fuel, foodstuff, and other goods would simply not be able to sustain permanent settlements or larger populations. In a previous video, we talked about the world of Rhodia, a humid and tropical planet in which the local inhabitants lived in climate-controlled domes. The Senator Anaconda Farr was a staunch Republic loyalist before the war began, but when the planet began experiencing food shortages with the outbreak of the war, Farr became increasingly agitated by the situation. And when his political allies like Padme Amidala and Bail Organa failed to get enough support from the Senate to address the issue, Anaconda Farr became disillusioned and eventually brokered a deal with Newt Gunray and the Trade Federation to lure Padme Amidala to his planet where the Rhodians would capture her. So how did Rhodia get into this crazy situation where it has to betray the Republic? Well, it's because it was highly dependent on the galactic supply chain for basic foodstuff. When pirates and more importantly separatist forces began patrolling and blockading the hyperspace lanes around Rhodia, which was right next to Geonosis where the war started, it became impossible for regular shipments of goods to come into the planet. What Rhodia was requesting was food and fuel convoys from the core regions that were escorted by armed convoys. But during the outbreak of the Clone Wars, the Galactic Republic Navy was overwhelmed with similar requests all over the galaxy. The Confederacy were smart. They knew exactly how to hurt the Republic, and they knew how to isolate many of these border worlds. And while the lack of defense forces on these planets was definitely an issue, destroying the supply chain was a far greater threat, because you can only last for so long without food. Now, this problem with the galactic supply chain dates all the way back to the Ruusan Reformation period more than 1,000 years earlier. The Ruusan Reformation occurred at the end of a devastating period of on-and-off war between the Republic and the Sith that went on for more than 4,000 years. Extreme violence made the galaxy turn towards extreme peace. With the destruction of the last Sith armies, the Republic would basically demilitarize its federal military and remove the Jedi from the military ranks. The federal military budget would be shifted to subsidize local planetary defense forces and militias. It's actually similar to Mon Mothma's plan when the New Republic defeated the Galactic Empire, but at least she was smart enough to keep a token force activated in the core regions. The Republic, after the Ruusan Reformation, got through by using a patched-together network of security forces and militias. In the core regions, you had some of the largest planetary defense forces in the galaxy, like the mighty Coruscant Guard and Coruscant Home Fleet. You also had the Quat Planetary Defense Force and Fleet, which, thanks to their massive shipyard, featured some of the largest ships in the known galaxy. Corellia also had a pretty badass PDF. Basically, any rich planet or planet with a large industrial or manufacturing base had a formidable defense. Now, we can think of these planetary defense forces as, stadies, but on steroids. No criminal in the right mind would want to mess with them, but at the same time, these planetary defense forces usually stayed in their local region and didn't pursue criminals or bandits outside of their territory. Only in extreme emergencies, when the federal government called for aid, would they go out of their own territories. On top of that, you had judicial forces accompanied by Jedi who were kind of like the US Marshals or FBI. They were able to pursue bandits that operated in multiple systems, and they could hunt down individual criminals, something that would be tougher for PDFs to do. And for about 1,000 years, this security network worked quite well, and the prosperity in the core regions of the Republic is a testament to that system working. Even in the Outer Rim, you had rich and successful worlds like Iradu. That's where Tarkin's family is from. The reason why Iradu was rich and powerful was because of the Outland region's security forces, one of the largest and most powerful in the Outer Rim. Nowadays it's very popular for people to say defund the police and just they hate the police as an institution, and I get where that comes from. At the same time, the most systematically racist thing that was done to African Americans in the past century was the removal of police from their neighborhoods, which of course created chaos. People who live in violent neighborhoods don't want to get rid of the police. They want better trained, more respectful police and, if possible, more police. Vigilantism on a wide scale is just complete chaos, and when there's no security, there's no economic development, which leads to no business, which leads to less tax revenue, which leads to no money for security. It's a vicious cycle. And that's just how things work in most societies. Now, the further out you get to the Outer Rim, that's exactly what started happening too in the Star Wars galaxy. The local planetary defense forces out here, aside from a few richer areas, were oftentimes outgunned by pirates or at least near peers when it came to firepower, which is really not a comfortable situation for the local people living there. The Jedi and Judicials, of course, were nowhere to be seen. Well, actually, during the High Republic era, the Central Government and the Jedi made a huge push to expand their control into the Outer Rim. They even established a beautiful space station called Starlight Beacon, and they even sent a few thousand knights out into the scary Outer Rim, and guess what happens? They get absolutely murked by a bunch of crazy marauders known as the Nile. Do you understand how crazy that is? We're talking about a small group of criminals who, in their defense, had some pretty unique hyperspace travel abilities, but this small group of criminals somehow was able to destroy the mighty Galactic Republic, a government that represented the entire galaxy. What the High Republic should have done was bring in millions of peacekeepers, entire fleets, and then, secured a section or an entire sector of the Outer Rim, allow that place to develop, allow that place to attract more business and revenue so that it could eventually pay for its own planetary defense force and then expand from there. But there's no real political gain in trying to do something like that to the Outer Rim. The unprecedented era of peace that the Republic enjoyed during this period made politicians complacent. But in all fairness, even the Empire would fail to tame the Outer Rim. It wasn't exactly an easy nut to crack. And so when the Clone Wars started, the Confederacy of Independent Systems had a huge advantage. They didn't really need to take over worlds or convince them politically to join their cause. All they had to do was to attack the fragile hyperspace lanes that surrounded mid and Outer Rim planets. To make matters worse, the further out into the peripherals you went, the less hyperspace lanes there were connecting each world, and the easier it would be to blockade and bottleneck resources. And so you had several worlds during the Clone Wars that were on the verge of starvation, from Christophsis to Ryloth, Rhodia we already mentioned, Mandalore, and many, many more. It doesn't matter how strong a military is if the troops on the ground aren't being fed. They will definitely capitulate after just a few days without eating. Mandalore is a great example of this. They'll try to stay neutral during the war, but it's almost impossible for them to do so, especially when you consider the fact that the planet's surface is an irradiated wasteland incapable of growing anything. Without black market and smugglers charging exorbitant prices for basic goods, Mandalore would have starved. And eventually the takeover of Mandalore by the Death Watch was partly due to this unrest and suffering the people had endured. To make matters worse, most of the largest agricultural worlds were located in the Outer Rim, planets like Ertagas, which was in the unknown sector. Ertagas realized pretty quickly after, Count Dooku gave the Raxus address that what he was saying was really true. Ertagas was feeding several different core world planets, yet it had almost no political power in the Senate, and so it would quickly secede. And when one part of the food supply chains, it has a cascading effect on food prices and living standards on many planets, which leads to more breaks in the supply chain, which leads to more panic, which then leads to panic buying and panic hoarding. I mean, planets will stop exporting food and fuel, even though they have more than enough to get out there into the rest of the galaxy, and that causes more starvation, more political instability. At one point, the Republic not only had trouble delivering food to loyal worlds in the Outer Rim, they also had problems reaching their own garrisons in the Outer Rim, as pockets of Republic troops were being surrounded and besieged by the massive droid army. One of the most important battles early on in the war was the battle for the Hutt's favor. The Republic desperately wanted to establish a resupply base in Toydarian space, and also wanted to gain access to Hutt space so that they could get around Confederate blockades and relieve their troops in the Outer Rim. If there is a silver lining here, it's that years and years of neglect made the citizens of the Outer Rim extremely tough and resilient. Isolationist groups or just well-prepared planets had their own food reserves, and some would even produce enough to sell to other worlds. Many planets made it throughout the Clone Wars without starving to death, simply because they weren't expecting any help from the Republic in the first place. Now, I think a lot of you guys watching at home right now are probably drawing some connections between what this video is talking about and what happened to our world during the pandemic a few years ago when the global supply chain more or less collapsed. As a matter of fact, 3 years later, it still hasn't completely recovered. Now, there's nothing wrong about global trade. I think the exchange of ideas, culture, goods, and material is essential for peace on Earth. It's one of the main reasons why China and the United States will most likely try to avoid war at all costs, and it's because neither economy can really handle it, and the world economy definitely can't either. But at the same time, it's why Russia and the United States are a little more likely to go to war, because Russia provides nothing that the United States actually needs. Now that we have the chance to rebuild our supply chains, we should focus on building supply chains that are based on logic and sustainability, not just profits alone. We need to make supply chains resilient in case of natural disasters or any future wars. And for all of you budding generals and star captains out there, remember, economics, logistics, and trade might not seem as sexy as the latest Star Destroyer coming out of Quattro Yards, but these boring things are what fuel a military, and without them, a military will completely collapse. The Republic defeated the Separatists, the Old Republic defeated the Sith Empire multiple times, not because of their military power, but because of their industrial might and their ability to transform it into a military-producing machine.